this comparison of man's body and its regular shape. You see, 10 fingers on either side. 5 fingers on either side makes 10. 5 toes on either side makes 10. And so by stretching ourselves out, as it were, against nature, we measured it. And the idea of measurement is the same idea as the idea of the law of nature. A law of nature is exactly the same kind of thing as a ruler, or a hammer, or a saw. It is a way of thinking which enables us to control our environment. By observing regularities, and then by making a calculus, which is a process really of betting. Will it be regular next time? And the odds are that it may be. If it's done it once this way, it's likely to do it again that way. So in this way, you predict eclipses of the sun. You predict the phases of the moon. You measure them. You count it. How it went, how often it did it like this, how often it did it like that. And you say, well, it keeps on doing it. And you think, wow, this is fascinating. It seems to obey me, because now I can tell you any time it's going to come up. And if the other people around haven't figured it out, they think I'm magic, because I'm going to say to them, the moon is going to change at such and such a time. So many days from now it's going to have a different shape. They'll say, my God, he was right. And they'll think I'm making it happen, because I can do that. And so I get a rather privileged position, because I could predict. But that's the basic idea, you see, of the law of nature. The law of nature is a human network, like the lines of celestial latitude and longitude. They don't exist in the heavens, but we project them on the sky in order to measure the positions of the stars. Because the stars are scattered in a very confusing way. And just try and remember that mess and figure it out. So the clever ones, you see, just said, look at it through a network, a spherical network. Then you can number all the squares in the spherical network in accordance with the principles of the circle, the 360 degrees. You've thrown the network on the sky. It isn't really there, see? Then to help you a little further, pick out some of the big stars and see if they make a shape. You know, this is like doing a Rorschach test. And you see, oh, look, there's one over there that looks like a dipper. Or some people call it a plough. And there's one there that looks like a cross. There's one there that, by some extreme wangling, can be made to look like a virgin. And all these lines that join the constellations together are our ways of projecting a pattern upon this great and glorious confusion, so that we can remember it and chart it. But obviously, you can very well see that if you looked at this same pattern of stars from some completely different position in space, all those constellations and their arrangements would vanish. You would have to invent a new one. Because there is nowhere where the stars really are. It depends where you're looking from. So in this sense then, man in nature, with his extraordinary symmetrical brain and its amazing complications, figures it out. And it's man who introduces the law into the world. He invents it. But in a way, invenire, to invent, is to discover. But what we discover, in a way, is not something that's out there. When we invent the laws of nature, we are discovering something about ourselves and our own passion for prediction, for regularity, for keeping things under control. Therefore, there has to be a law. So then, going back right now to the beginning of what I started to say, the question was then, what is the law of relationship between the atoms, between the fundamental billiard balls of which the world is composed? Well, you watch the game of billiards, and there's a cue, and it hits that ball, and then it moves over, and it hits that one, and then that hits that one, and then that hits that one. And so the final ball, which moves into the pocket, has its behavior explained through its contact with the other billiard balls and the final contact with the cue. That's why it did it. And so this view of the world as something that happens by the mechanical processes of the law of cause and effect is one that is really basic to most people's common sense today, to most educated people. They would say it's very difficult to figure it all out because the whole thing is so complicated. But if you could know all the details involved in, say, the behavior or a single act of a human being, you would find that it was the ineluctable result of a series of bouncing balls against each other, fundamental atoms that predisposed the great final event to be just like that. So that theory of the relationship between the atoms is called, in technical language, catenary. C-A-T-E-N-A-R-Y, catenary. A catenary effect, or a relationship between events, is like, for example, to use another illustration, where you stand a row of bricks up, end up, and you knock over the first one and they all go kata, 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 and fall down. That is a catenary sequence. But it becomes increasingly obvious today to the physicist and to the biologist that that will not do as a sufficient description of how various events affect each other. And so there's another type of causal relationship altogether, which is called, instead of catenary, reticulate. R-E-T-I-C-U-L-A-T-E, reticulate, from the Latin rete, meaning a net relationship. Wherein, in other words, any given event is not simply ascribed to one or more previous events, but that the relationship between the past and the present, and between the present and the future, is all to be taken into consideration in understanding any one event. In other words, let's take one event. I drop a ball and it bounces. Let's say it's an event. I don't know how many events it really is, but we'll just say, for the sake of argument, that it's an event. Now, is it enough in describing this event to say, I let the ball go, it obeyed the law of gravity and hit the floor, but because it was made of rubber and had some air inside it, it bounced and sort of slightly disobeyed gravity because it had an energy in it. But that's not enough. Because that the ball dropped, that I let it go, that it bounced, depended not merely upon a historical sequence of events that you can lay out in a string along a line of time. It depends also upon a present context. There must be a certain density of air. All kinds of things have to coexist with this in order for me to be there to drop the ball at all. much less manufacture a ball. So that what happens must be considered not merely as a historical phenomenon, but it must be seen in context. Context is terribly important, because it isn't just when a thing happens that is important, it's where it happens. In what setting? So that you could say that my blood in my veins is in a certain setting. In a test tube, it's in a completely different setting. And in a test tube, my blood is not behaving in the way it behaves in my veins. Therefore, it's not the same thing. So, an individual person in one setting will behave in one way, in another setting in a completely different way. I remember when I was a child. I was one boy when I was at home with my parents. When I went to visit my uncle and aunt, I was someone different. When I was with my peers, I was someone quite different. Because I changed according to the setting, and children are very well aware of this. It's only as we go on that we keep having it drummed into our heads that we ought to have a consistent character, because we're influenced by novels, where the characters are supposed to be consistent. And so you ought to have a consistent character. You ought to behave the same in all circumstances and towards all people. That merely means you become inflexible. So what things are, therefore, depend on the context in which they are found, upon their network relationship to everything else that's going on. And one of the reasons for this, which is going to lead us to something more profound but much simpler, is, of course, that the whole notion of a thing or of an event in nature and of causal relationships between different things and different events is a purely abstract idea that does not really fit the facts of nature at all. In nature, in this physical world that you feel when you hold your head or hold somebody's hand or just breathe, in that world there aren't any separate events. None whatever. Sure, there are all sorts of wiggles around here, all sorts of lines, all sorts of colors, all sorts of surfaces, all sorts of forms, but they're not separate. Because you see, you can't separate an inside, what you are inside your skin, from the outside of the skin. Because you can see that at once. If there weren't anything outside your skin, there'd be no inside. It takes the outside and the inside working together to create this situation. And in the simplest way, the situation that I call my body wouldn't be operating unless there was air around here to breathe. This physical phenomenon goes with the situation of there being air. Now, true, it wiggles about inside the air in a rather complicated way. And other people watching say, oh, something going on over there. You know, because the air you can't see and it remains rather constant except when there's a gale. And so you don't pay much attention to it because it's always around. What you pay attention to is what changes rather rapidly. And you say, well, that's a that. Say, hey, you say to someone, you see this change going on, some wiggling over there, and say, what's that? See? And he knows what you mean by a that. A that means something on the end of a finger point. It's different. It's peculiar. See? That's a that. So from that comes the idea of an event, or a thing, a that. But all these that's that are happening aren't disconnected. They go with each other, just as I go with the surrounding air, and just as this whole situation in which we are at this moment is a complicated going-withness. Now here then we get to the fundamental idea, this idea of going with. And from this we shall be able to construct the whole notion of network. And this is the idea I said at the beginning. It is extremely simple, but very difficult for people brought up to use Western languages to understand. Now, going withness, we could call it relativity, relationship. Means simply, let me first of all put it in a very extreme form. Consider yourself, sitting here at this moment, being just exactly the sort of person you are. Maybe a little neurotic, maybe a little sick physically, maybe a little ashamed of yourself for some reason or other, or whatever, you know? Just the way you are anyway, just like that, sitting here. That situation goes with, as back goes with front, the entire situation of the rest of the universe. In other words, you as you are, exactly the way you are, and you really don't know what that is. You may have some opinions about it, but you really don't know. That goes with the way the whole of the rest of boundless being is arranged. Now, it isn't that the way the rest of boundless being is arranged is determining you to be the way you are. Or if it is that, if that's true, if it determines you, then we must also allow the other side of the picture that you determine it. It's your karma. You did it. But you say, no, but I didn't. I couldn't help it. It did me. And you can say, tisn't, like two children arguing until you realize that the argument was stupid. Because you and it are one event, and it isn't a question of it controlling you or you controlling it. It's all one event. As Teilhard de Chardin said, the whole universe is the only true atom, the only truly indivisible whole. So the human being, though, finds this difficult to understand because we're always telling each other, now you should be different. You ought to change. You don't be like that. Now listen, you're sick, and I got a system. See, I've got a system. I've got a real school here, a thing that is very important, and you should come and study with that. It may not be mine, it may be some big sage or pundit that I know, and you should come around and study that. And I've thought about this for a long time, because I've heard every kind of opinion of all the sorts of things that I should do in order to get myself into shape. And I realized that if I followed this advice, I would spend my entire day doing exercises in preparation for life. I don't know when I'd ever get around to that. You know, I would have my half an hour's yoga practice, 1 hour of zazen, so much physical exercises, and so much memory practice, so much special diet preparation to be sure that I got proper food. And if I think this all through, I think, oh my God, it isn't worth it. Then another school of thought will say, no, that's the thing, you're getting confused. Just do one thing, see? But then I say, now how am I going to choose which one I'm going to do? Well, he says, obviously this one's the best. And then before you know where you are, you're sewed up by some religious fanatic. Now, please, I don't want to do this to you. Please don't think that I have any such recipe that I'm going to give you anything to do for 5 minutes every morning. I just am not. I want to, my whole notion would be to set you all free so that you'd only have to attend one seminar, never have to come back. That's the idea, really. Because I know that so far as my own livelihood is concerned, that there are always more people. And if, no, I don't collect a following and just send them all away. There are plenty more people to fill the vacuum.